China in the early 19th century stood as one of the most dazzling realms the world had ever known. To outsiders who caught even a glimpse of its treasures, it appeared timeless, eternal, a civilization whose roots reached back thousands of years. The Middle Kingdom, as its people called it, believed itself to be the very center of the earth, a land blessed by heaven with rivers that fed rice paddies, mountains that guarded its heartlands, and a culture that had shaped art, philosophy, and governance for countless generations. Its palaces in Beijing, gilded with gold and lacquer, echoed with the footsteps of mandarins in silk robes, while in the bustling markets of Canton, merchants haggled over porcelain, jade, and tea, luxuries so coveted abroad that European aristocrats measured their status by how much of them they owned. Chinese silks wrapped noble women in London and Paris. Porcelain vases glittered in Vienna salons, and the delicate ritual of tea had become not merely a drink, but a symbol of refinement in the West. All of this wealth flowed out of China in exchange for silver, filling the coffers of the Qing dynasty. The empire was immense, ruled by an emperor who styled himself the Son of Heaven. His court was a world of rigid ceremony, kotos, long prostrations, and the belief that he alone mediated between heaven and earth. Scholars memorized Confucian classics for years in hopes of passing the imperial exams, the key to joining the ranks of officials who governed this sprawling land. Peasants bowed before ancestral tablets, craftsmen carved dragons into wood and stone. Poets compared the moonlight to pure jade. Life was bound by tradition, and tradition seemed unbreakable. Yet beneath this grandeur, cracks had already begun to spread. The empire was proud, yes, but also complacent. The Qing dynasty saw itself as self-sufficient, needing nothing from outsiders. Europeans, with their strange machines and thirst for trade, were tolerated at best, confined to small quarters in southern ports and dismissed as barbarians who should be grateful for whatever crumbs of commerce they were allowed. The Chinese court demanded tribute from foreign envoys, refusing to acknowledge any power as equal. To the emperor, China was the center of the world, and the rest mere satellites revolving around its brilliance. But history is merciless toward pride. The very wealth that dazzled outsiders had also bred corruption. Eunuchs whispered in palace corridors, governors lined their pockets, and peasants often bore the weight of crushing taxes, while officials recited empty words about harmony. Famine struck when rivers flooded or dried, and rebellion brewed in remote provinces where hunger gnawed more deeply than loyalty. For centuries the empire had survived such storms, yet the coming tempest would be unlike any before. That tempest would begin not with armies at first, nor with invasions of cavalry or cannons, but with something far more insidious, a flower dried and boiled in the smoked opium. Before the poison seeped into the veins of China, the empire was still magnificent, vast beyond comprehension, ancient in its traditions, radiant in its arts. To understand the tragedy that followed, one must first see what was lost. For in the tea houses of Suzhou, where lanterns glowed on painted bridges, and in the rice terraces of the south, where farmers bent under the sun with songs on their lips, there was still harmony, there was still beauty. There was still the fragile illusion that the Middle Kingdom was eternal, and it was this illusion that would be shattered. While the Qing Empire projected majesty to the world, beyond its southern harbors foreign sails gathered like storm clouds. From the late 18th century onward, European ships arrived with greater persistence, their tall masts piercing the horizon, their decks heavy with goods they hoped to exchange for China's treasures. To the mandarins in Beijing, these men were tolerated but not respected. They were permitted a foothold only in Canton, confined to the so-called factories, foreign warehouses along the Pearl River, where trade was conducted under strict regulation. They were watched carefully, allowed no free movement, and required to bow to Chinese merchants as if supplicants. Yet the Western hunger for Chinese goods was insatiable. Tea had become a necessity in Britain. Porcelain filled the drawing rooms of Europe, and silk clothed courts from Vienna to Madrid. Silver flowed eastward in torrents, draining treasuries in Europe, "We are pouring our wealth into a bottomless well," wrote one British merchant in despair. And yet the thirst for tea grows greater by the year. The imbalance gnawed at Britain most of all. London financiers fretted over the trade deficit, and politicians demanded a remedy. What could Britain sell to China in return? Textiles were dismissed as inferior, clocks and watches admired, but unnecessary. The Chinese, confident in their self-sufficiency, looked at Western goods with polite disdain. "We have all we require," declared the Qianlong Emperor in a famous letter to King George III. "Your manufactures are of no value to us." But history rarely accepts such certainties. For among the cargo carried by British and Indian traders was a product small in weight, but vast in consequence: opium, harvested in Bengal, pressed into bricks, and shipped eastward in secret. At first it was a trickle, an experiment, but soon the trickle swelled into a tide dot to the mandarins. Opium was known, but marginal, used in medicine in tiny amounts, regarded with suspicion, but not fear. They did not yet grasp that when smoked in pipes rather than swallowed in tinctures, it became a demon dot in Canton. The first clouds of this new storm gathered in dim alleys, where foreign merchants whispered to Chinese intermediaries. Silver, once flowing only one way, began to return west. In tea houses, wealthy officials experimented with pipes, the sweet smoke curling upward like incense. Some laughed at its novelty, others felt a languor so pleasant they sought it again. And so the pattern began. Let us look not at emperors for a moment, but at ordinary souls. In a fishing village near the Pearl River Delta lived a man named Li Wei, whose father had taught him the rhythms of the tides, when to cast nets and when to wait. His family sold fish in the market of Canton, earning just enough to survive. Li Wei had seen the foreign ships anchored offshore, vast wooden beasts with sails like wings. As a boy, he had wondered what riches they carried. As a man, he would learn they carried ruin. One evening, after a long day on the river, he followed a friend into a tea house. There, in a corner, a merchant was offering something new: dark pellets of opium. "It sharpens dreams," the man promised, "and eases pain." Curiosity overcame caution. Li Wei inhaled, and for the first time felt the false warmth spread through his body, the soft fog dulling hunger and fatigue. He laughed with his friends that night. He did not yet know that this small indulgence would coil itself around his life like a snake. Multiply Li Wei by thousands, and you begin to see the shadow lengthening. What seemed harmless entertainment among the wealthy began seeping downward, reaching soldiers, farmers, students. Pipes were passed quietly behind closed doors, then more openly. Some grew thin, their cheeks hollow. Their families hungry as silver coins were spent not on rice but on smoke. The mandarins in Beijing received reports, but they were slow, filtered, diluted. How could something so trivial threaten the empire that had endured for millennia? The emperor's court, wrapped in ritual and hierarchy, believed itself insulated. But beyond the walls of the forbidden city, a silent invasion was underway, not of soldiers, but of smoke dot. By the turn of the 19th century, the British East India Company had perfected its system. Opium grown in India was auctioned in Calcutta, shipped under false manifests, transferred to private traders, and smuggled into China by Chinese brokers eager for profit. The river of silver now flowed back toward Britain, and the coffers of the company swelled. Back in London, tea continued to pour into the cups of every household, rich and poor alike. The morning pot, the afternoon service, the evening ritual, all depended on Chinese leaves. Few of those sipping it realized that the coins they spent to buy their tea were now paid by Chinese families selling their futures for opium. A London gentleman might remark on the fine glaze of a Chinese teacup, never imagining that the craftsman who shaped it might now be coughing in an opium den, his hands trembling too much to work. Thus the trade imbalance was reversed, not through invention, not through honest exchange, but through poison. The West had found its leverage, and China, proud and ancient, had unknowingly opened the door to its undoing as the 19th century unfolded. The presence of opium in China grew like a shadow stretching over the land, lengthening with each passing year. What had once been a curiosity reserved for the wealthy now seeped into villages, military camps, and the very halls of officials who were sworn to uphold order. The drug did not march like an invading army with drums and banners. It crept silently, pipe by pipe, until its smoke blurred the vision of an empire that had believed itself eternal. In the capital, mandarins received reports that painted a troubling picture. Soldiers once feared for their discipline now slumped in barracks, their muskets lying untouched as they chased the next pipeful of smoke. Farmers pawned tools, wives wept as coin vanished from household jars, and fathers who should have been guiding their sons stumbled through streets with clouded eyes. The rice paddies grow thin, one local governor warned, for the hands that should be strong are weak, and the minds that should be vigilant are dulled. Yet each time such reports reached higher authorities, they were softened or buried. Some officials themselves were addicted, others bribed by merchants, and many more simply wished to avoid stirring the wrath of powerful traders. It was easier to collect taxes on opium dens than to close them, easier to profit from the silver that flowed back into coffers than to confront the rot spreading beneath. Still, there were voices of warning. Among them was Lin Zexu, a scholar and administrator whose reputation for honesty was rare in those days. Born to a modest family in Fujian, Lin had risen through the grueling imperial exams, proving himself a man of unusual intellect and iron will. Unlike many of his peers, he did not cloak corruption with poetry or excuses. He saw the devastation in villages with his own eyes, and he wrote bitterly of it. Those who smoke become like ghosts before death has claimed them. Families crumble, children go hungry, and the state bleeds its silver into foreign hands. One's anger was shared by some, but ignored by many. After all, opium had become not only a poison, but also a pillar of profit. Smugglers grew wealthy, corrupt officials lined their sleeves with bribes, and British merchants counted fortunes in Calcutta and London. For every addict slumped in a Canton alley, there was a banker in London raising a glass of port to celebrate another year of tea imports secured by the silver extracted from China's veins. But let us leave these broad strokes for a moment and turn again to the lives of individuals, where the tragedy was most stark. Leeway. The fisherman we glimpsed before was no longer laughing in tea houses. His nets grew ragged, his catch smaller. Nights once spent mending his boat were now spent in smoke-filled dens, where men coughed and muttered, their eyes glassy, their laughter brittle. His wife, May, pleaded with him to stop, clutching their hungry son to her chest. The sea will not feed us if you sell our coins for smoke, she begged. But Li Wei's strength waned, and with it his will. Soon his boat was sold, then their meager furniture, until the family lived in a bare hut with little but shadows. In another province, a young scholar named Zhang Rui prepared for the imperial exams, the dream of every educated youth. His brush once moved gracefully across paper, painting Confucian verses in elegant strokes. But curiosity led him to try a pipe offered by a fellow student. The calm it gave seemed to steady his hand at first, to sharpen his mind. But soon he craved it not for clarity, but for escape. His poems grew incoherent, his memory faltered, and on the day of the exam, he collapsed before finishing even the first question. He has wasted the ancestors' hopes, his father declared, turning his face away. The shame was heavier than hunger. These were not isolated tales. They multiplied across the empire. For every soldier too weak to march, a family lost protection. For every scholar who failed, a province lost a leader. The opium pipe was hollowing out the empire from within, its smoke curling into every crevice of society. Meanwhile, in the ports, British merchants smiled at their success. They spoke openly of the triangle trade, opium from India to China, silver from China to Britain, and British goods to the world. In Calcutta, auctions of opium bricks drew eager crowds. the bales stamped with seals like treasures. The East India Company's ships carried them under false manifests, but everyone involved knew their true cargo. In London, parliamentarians debated the morality of this trade, but each cup of tea on their desks, each saucer of porcelain at their tables, dulled the edge of conscience. Profit was louder than morality. And still, the king court clung to illusions. The forbidden city, with its vermilion walls and golden roofs, remained a world apart, where officials bowed 3 times and recited rituals as if the empire outside were unchanged. The emperor believed the mandate of heaven eternal, that floods and famines could be managed as they always had been, that barbarians could never threaten the heart of China. But the threat had already entered, not with armies but with smoke, and it was spreading faster than any rebellion. Lin Zexu wrote again, this time with sharper words. If we do not cut out this rot, it will consume us from the inside. Better to banish the foreign traders and burn their wares, than to watch the people waste into shadows. His pleas would soon bring him to the center of history. But for now, they were still warnings. Warnings ignored by many who profited. Warnings drowned in the clink of silver coins, in the hiss of pipes, in the laughter of men who mistook ruin for pleasure. The stage was set. The empire still glittered on the surface, but its foundations trembled. And beyond the horizon, in London's banks and in Calcutta's auctions, plans were already being laid that would turn this quiet corruption into open war. When at last the king emperor grew weary of the endless reports of weakness, famine, and corruption tied to opium, he turned to a man whose integrity was known even among cynics. Lin Zexu in 1838, Lin was summoned to the imperial court, his reputation as incorruptible preceding him like a shield. If any man can cleanse the empire of this poison, the emperor declared, it is Lin. And so Lin was dispatched south, to Canton, the beating heart of the foreign trade, where the smoke was thickest and the enemy most entrenched. Lin Zexu did not travel in splendor, though his position afforded him honor guards and sedan chairs. He insisted on seeing the villages along the way. He stopped in market towns where he spoke to peasants whose sons had wasted away in dens. He visited schools where boys no longer recited Confucius but sat listless, their brushes falling from trembling hands. He saw fields untended, nets uncast, families in tatters. By the time he reached Canton, his resolve was no longer merely duty. It was fury. The foreign merchants in Canton did not fear him at first. They had seen mandarins come and go, men who thundered against vice one day and accepted bribes the next. But Lin was different. On his arrival, he issued a proclamation, written in elegant but sharp brush strokes. The smoke of this farm poison has spread to every province. Soldiers lie idle, scholars fail, families starve. Do you not know that heaven watches? Do you not fear your crimes? Let all who sell opium seize at once or face punishment. Let all who smoke it destroy their pipes. Those who defy this command will meet justice without mercy. Copies of this edict were plastered on the walls of Canton, read aloud in tea houses, carried on the wind through the Pearl River Delta. For the first time, the addicts felt shame burn hotter than hunger. Some smashed their pipes in fear. Others hid them deeper. But it was not the peasants or even the minor merchants that Lin targeted. His true quarry was the British. He knew that behind every Chinese dealer stood a Western ship anchored offshore, its hull packed with bricks of opium harvested in India. He also knew that without foreign supply, the domestic hunger could not grow, and so he moved with speed. In the spring of 1839, Lin summoned the foreign merchants to Canton's official hall. With calm voice and piercing eyes, he declared, you will hand over your opium. You will sign pledges never to trade it again. And if you refuse, you will not trade here at all. The merchants were stunned. To them, Canton was the gateway not only to tea, but to riches unimaginable. To lose it would be to lose the lifeblood of their companies. Some tried to bluster. We are not under your laws, one shouted. Others muttered about their rights as British subjects. But Lin was unmoved. In this land, heaven's law is above all. and heaven will not permit poison to destroy its children. After weeks of tension, blockade, and negotiation, the merchants relented. Under pressure from both Lent and the looming threat of violence, they surrendered their stores. Over 20,000 chests of opium, stacked high like mountains. Each chest was packed with bricks, and each brick represented not only profit, but a chain around some family's neck. What followed was a spectacle unlike any China had seen. At Human, near the mouth of the Pearl River, Lin ordered massive trenches dug. Salt and lime were poured in, seawater carried by buckets. The chests were smashed open, their contents dumped into the pits. Workers stirred the black sludge with long poles as the lime hissed and the salt dissolved, until the smoke of destruction rose. For days the work continued, until the opium, worth millions to the merchants, was nothing but foul water running into the sea. On the shore, crowds gathered, some wept with relief, believing at last their torment was ending. Others watched in awe as the empire struck back against the foreign invader. A fisherman murmured to his son, "Look, the poison returns to the sea. Perhaps now the nets will fill again." But on the decks of British ships anchored offshore, the mood was not relief but rage. The merchants saw their fortunes destroyed, their pride insulted, their empire challenged. Letters flew across the oceans, from Canton to Calcutta, from Calcutta to London. In parlors and parliament halls, British officials pounded their fists. "This is not merely the destruction of property," they cried. "This is an insult to Britain herself." Tea still flowed into Britain's cups, but now every sip carried bitterness. The newspapers fumed, demanding retribution. The East India Company lobbied fiercely. If China could destroy their opium with impunity, what would prevent them from cutting off tea as well? The government, pressured by merchants and driven by imperial pride, began to whisper the word that would soon echo like thunder. Wardat and Solon Zeksu, the incorruptible, the righteous, the man who sought only to save his people, became both hero and target. In Chinese villages, mothers blessed his name. In London, his name became a curse, painted as a tyrant who had dared to defy the empire on which the sun never set. The lines were drawn. One side fought for its people's survival, the other for its profits. And in between, on the waters of the Pearl River, sails began to gather, dark against the horizon. When the last chest of opium at Human was destroyed and its ashes washed into the sea, a silence settled briefly over the Pearl River Delta. Many peasants believed the curse had been lifted, that their empire had struck a decisive blow. But far beyond those shores, in London's drawing rooms and parliamentary halls, the smoke of the destruction became fire. British merchants demanded compensation. The East India Company lobbied furiously, and newspapers fanned public outrage. The language of injury transformed into the rhetoric of national pride. "The honor of Britain has been insulted," wrote one editorial, "and it must be avenged upon the presumptuous Celestial Empire." In the summer of 1839, the first ships of the Royal Navy appeared on the horizon, their hulls dark, their sails white against the sky. To the Chinese villagers watching from the shore, they seemed like iron dragons, bristling with cannon mouths. Children clutched their mothers, fishermen lowered their nets, and word spread quickly upriver. "The barbarians have come with warships." The king commanders did not quake at first. For centuries they had believed in the invincibility of the Middle Kingdom. Soldiers drilled with muskets and spears, banners embroidered with dragons unfurled. Drums thundered across the camps. "We will drive them into the sea," declared one general confidently. But what they did not understand was the revolution that had occurred in Western warfare. While king cannons were cast of bronze, inaccurate and slow to reload, the British ships carried iron guns that could strike from miles away with deadly precision. While Chinese junks were built for rivers and coasts, the British frigates were floating fortresses. The first clashes revealed this brutal disparity. At Chwenpi, near the mouth of the Pearl River, King Force opened fire on British ships. Smoke bellowed, drums beat, soldiers cheered. But the British guns answered with thunder. Their shells ripped through wooden walls, splintered ships, sent men flying. A single broadside from HMS Volage and HMS Hyacinth silenced batteries that had stood for decades. The Chinese soldiers fought bravely, but bravery could not bridge centuries of technological divide. Let us pause from the grand battles to glimpse the men caught within them. In one riverside village lived Chen Hao, a young farmer pressed into service. He had never held a musket before the war. His hands were more familiar with hoes and plows. On the day of battle, he stood on the wall of a fort, his heart pounding as the dragon banners snapped in the wind. When the British shell struck, the ground shook, the air filled with screams. Chen dropped his musket, fell to his knees, and covered his ears. He survived the day, but when he returned home, half the houses of his village were burned, and his brother lay dead. For him, the Opium War was not a matter of trade or pride, but of grief carved into his family's bones. Meanwhile, in London, few imagined such suffering. The war was spoken of in terms of strategy, commerce, and empire. Politicians debated not whether it was just, but how quickly victory could be won. To them, China was an obstinate giant that needed to be humbled for refusing free trade. The reality of shattered villages and grieving families never reached their tables. The fighting spread along the coast. The British targeted ports, blockaded rivers, and seized islands. Jiaoshan, an island off Ningbo, fell quickly, its defenders overwhelmed by naval bombardment. In Canton, trade ground to a halt. Panic spread inland as refugees fled burning towns. The very empire that once believed itself eternal now faced humiliation, not at the hands of a vast invading army, but of a few dozen warships carrying the thunder of the Industrial Revolution. Lin Zexu, still determined, refused to surrender. He traveled tirelessly, urging resistance, rallying governors, writing letters that thundered with moral conviction. The smoke of poison is one battle, he told his men, but the fire of justice is another. Heaven will not abandon us if we do not abandon ourselves. His words inspired some, but the guns of the West drowned out even the strongest conviction. The King Court, safe behind the vermilion walls of the Forbidden City, struggled to grasp the scale of the disaster. Reports arrived slowly, often softened by terrified officials. The emperor grew angry, then despairing, torn between outrage and fear. Ministers whispered of negotiation, of compromise, but pride still outweighed caution. How can the Celestial Empire bow to barbarians? The emperor asked. Yet every day the barbarians advanced further, their sails appearing like ghosts on new horizons. In Canton, families like Li Wei suffered in silence. He, once a fisherman, now a hollow addict, could no longer provide for his wife and son. May carried baskets of rice for soldiers, trading labor for scraps of food. She listened to the distant cannon fire, each boom a reminder that the empire was unraveling. Her son, once playful and curious, now asked questions she could not answer. Mother, why do the foreigners hate us? Why do the men cough and sleep all day? She pressed him to her chest and wept. Thus the war was not only fought on rivers and seas, but also in kitchens and huts, in the emptiness of rice jars and the silence of broken families. The clash of empires was measured not just in treaties and battles, but in the hunger of children and the tears of widows. By 1841, the British had pressed far beyond Canton. They moved north, striking along the coast, forcing open ports one by one. The King armies, still brave but ill-equipped, fell back again and again. Cities that had stood for centuries surrendered in days. The myth of invincibility shattered, and the world began to see that the Middle Kingdom was vulnerable. But even as the empire faltered, ordinary people endured. Some clung to rituals, burning incense before ancestors' tablets, praying for deliverance. Others fled inland, carrying what little they could on their backs. And some, like Lin Zexu, fought on with words, penning letters that even today are remembered. A man's voice, small against the roar of cannons, declaring that right must stand against might. By 1841, the Qing Empire staggered under the relentless advance of British forces. The war that had begun in the Pearl River Delta spread northward like fire racing through dry grass. Each port that fell was another wound carved into the Middle Kingdom's body. Each fortress that crumbled another echo of humiliation. The dragon banners still flew, but they were torn, faded, carried by men who no longer believed in their invincibility. The British strategy was ruthless in its efficiency. Their fleet struck like thunderbolts, bypassing defenses, cutting supply lines, and choosing targets with merciless calculation. In January 1841, they captured the forts at the Boca Tigris. By summer, Jiaoshan Island lay in their hands. The Qing troops fought bravely, but bravery alone was no match for disciplined volleys and modern cannons died in Ningbo, one of the great trading ports of the eastern coast. Life dissolved into panic. Merchants shuttered their shops, families fled inland, and temples overflowed with supplicants praying for divine intervention. Among them was a widow named Yan, who clutched her two daughters as she whispered before the statue of Guanyin, "Protect us. Holy One, do not let the foreigners take them." When the British stormed the city, she fled with hundreds of others into the countryside, carrying only a bundle of rice and a wooden comb. Her house was left behind, her husband's tablet on the family altar abandoned to dust. Such stories multiplied with every battle. At Shanghai, the defenders tried to block the harbor with chains stretched across the water. The British frigates shattered them with a few volleys and sailed through, their sails billowing white against the smoke. Soldiers leapt ashore, bayonets flashing, while the defenders fled in chaos. In a single day, the city was lost. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the Forbidden City still shimmered with ritual and illusion. The emperor sat on his throne, his robes of yellow silk embroidered with dragons, while his ministers knelt and pressed their foreheads to the cold marble floor. But the reports piling before him told a different story. Fortresses fallen, silver drained, soldiers deserting. The mandate of heaven, that invisible thread that bound ruler and ruled, trembled. The court was divided. Some officials urged continued resistance, insisting that to surrender would shame the dynasty for generations. Others whispered that the barbarians' guns were unstoppable, that peace was the only salvation. One minister, trembling, admitted, "We are fighting an enemy centuries ahead of us. To persist is to bleed endlessly." But pride was a heavy chain. The emperor, torn between rage and despair, delayed decisions until disaster made them unavoidable. Lin Zexu, once hailed as savior, now found himself accused. His destruction of opium had sparked the war. His enemies in the court painted him as reckless to severe, blind to the empire's fragility. He was recalled from Canton, stripped of authority, his letters ignored. "I sought only to save the people," he wrote bitterly, "and now I am cast aside." While the poison and the enemy marched unhindered, history would later vindicate his honor. But in that moment, he bore the loneliness of a man punished for his righteousness. The British pressed further. By mid-1842, their fleet sailed up the Yangtze River, the great artery of China, threatening the very heart of the empire. Town after town fell, unable to withstand bombardment. At Xinjiang, the fighting was brutal. The defenders resisted with desperate courage, but the cannons of the Royal Navy tore the city apart. Civilians fled through burning streets, mothers clutching infants, old men staggering with what little they could carry. When the smoke cleared, the Union Jack flew over the city walls. Now nothing stood between the invaders and Nanjing, the ancient capital. Its walls loomed tall, but inside, panic spread like plague. Refugees poured into the city, their stories filling the air with terror. The foreigners burn everything. Their shells tear stone like paper. The rivers run red. The people looked to their officials for protection, but the officials looked only to each other. Whispering of surrender died in the Forbidden City. The emperor's court finally broke. Pride had bled too much. Silver reserves were empty, armies scattered, ports occupied. To continue meant risk of losing not just cities but the dynasty itself. And so the decision was made. The Qing Empire would sue for peace. The negotiations took place aboard a British ship anchored near Nanjing. On one side sat the British envoys, stiff in their uniforms, papers already drawn up. On the other, the King commissioners, robes heavy, faces pale, their eyes lowered. The terms were read aloud. China would cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain. 5 ports, including Canton and Shanghai, would be opened to foreign trade. A vast indemnity in silver would be paid. British subjects would enjoy extraterritorial rights, immune from Chinese law. Each clause was a dagger. The commissioners shifted uneasily, but they signed. They had no choice. The war was lost, the empire humbled. Thus was born the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, the first of what would be remembered as the unequal treaties. For the British, it was victory, profit, and pride restored. For China, it was the beginning of what they would later call the century of humiliation. When news reached the villages, reactions were mixed. Some rejoiced that the war had ended, that the thunder of cannons would finally cease. Others despaired at the loss of sovereignty, sensing that something sacred had been broken. In Li Wei's village, Mei listened as neighbors whispered of Hong Kong, of foreigners now walking freely in Chinese cities, of silver that would never return. She held her son close and murmured, "The empire has bent. What will become of us now?" And far away in London, merchants raised their glasses. Tea poured into cups. Opium profits secured. New markets opened. Few spared a thought for the families who had lost homes, sons, and futures across the sea. The war was over, but the wound it left in China was only beginning to fester. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed in ink, but its consequences were carved into the lives of millions. What seemed like dry clauses on parchment translated into hunger, humiliation, and dislocation across China. For Britain, it was a triumph. For China, a shackle dot in Canton. The news spread quickly. At first, many ordinary people could not understand what the treaty meant. They had no notion of extraterritoriality or indemnities. But they understood when foreign ships anchored in the harbor not as temporary intruders, but as permanent masters of trade. They understood when merchants from London and Calcutta strolled through their streets with arrogance, while Chinese officials bowed their heads. Hong Kong, once a sparsely inhabited island of fishermen and granite hills, now transformed overnight. British engineers carved docks and warehouses into its rocky coast. Streets filled with foreign shops, taverns, and offices. A Union Jack flew where once only seabirds circled. To the Chinese villagers who still clung to the island, it felt like exile in their own home. One fisherman, surnamed Wu, told his son, "This place was ours. The sea gave us life. Now we sell our catch to foreigners, and they laugh at our speech." It is no longer China. Shanghai, one of the 5 treaty ports, also began to change. Western merchants rented riverfront land, building grain houses with tall windows and iron gates. They brought with them clerks, missionaries, and soldiers. The old order of guilds and mandarins weakened as foreign concessions carved the city into strange territories. A Chinese farmer from a nearby village, walking into Shanghai for the first time, gasped when he saw signs in English, churches rising beside temples, and foreign soldiers marching through the streets. He returned home and said to his neighbors, "It is no longer the Shanghai we knew. It is like another country planted in the soil of ours." The economic consequences were equally devastating. The indemnity demanded by Britain, 21 million silver dollars, drained the empire's coffers. Taxes on peasants rose sharply to pay for it. Families who already struggled to survive saw officials demanding grain or coin at their doors. One farmer in Anhui province, already burdened by floods, sold his daughter into servitude to pay the new levy. He wept as he handed her over, whispering, "Forgive me, child. The empire has taken more from us than I can bear." Meanwhile, opium flowed more freely than ever. The very substance that Lin Zexu had sought to ban now entered ports without resistance. Merchants grew rich, but families crumbled. In villages along the Yangtze, Fathers lay sprawled in smoke-filled rooms, pipes clutched in trembling hands, while their children cry for food. A mother named Sun, desperate to feed her sons, begged her husband to stop. The silver you spend on smoke could buy rice. But he only stared at her with hollow eyes, lost in dreams the foreigners had sold him. The cultural shock was no less profound. Missionaries arrived in increasing numbers, preaching a foreign faith. Some came with sincerity, opening schools and clinics, offering help. Others came with disdain, calling Chinese gods idols and ridiculing centuries of tradition. Conflicts flared. In one village near Ningbo, a missionary's attempt to tear down a shrine sparked a riot. The villagers beat him until soldiers intervened. To them, it was not merely about religion, but about survival. If their gods fell, what protection would remain? And in Beijing, the humiliation festered. The emperor cloaked himself in rituals, but the officials knew the truth. Reports from the provinces spoke of unrest, of bandits multiplying, of peasants whispering that the dynasty had lost heaven's mandate. Some began to dream of rebellion. Others clung to hope that the foreigners might one day leave. But the foreigners had no intention of leaving. Their ships came and went like tides. Their demands grew bolder, their profits richer. Yet even in this dark time, stories of resilience shone. In Suzhou, a group of silk weavers formed a secret cooperative, refusing to let foreign traders crush their market. They pooled their earnings, supported each other, and swore never to abandon their craft. In Guangdong, women formed societies to rescue children from families selling them to pay taxes, hiding them in temples until they could be adopted by relatives. These acts did not undo the humiliation of the treaty, but they showed that China's spirit was not entirely broken still. The century of humiliation had begun. The Treaty of Nanjing was only the first step. Other powers, France, America, later Russia, looked upon China's weakness with hungry eyes. Each sought their share, each demanded their treaty, each carved their privileges. What Britain had started, others would continue. And for the people, the pain deepened year by year. In May's village, where once she and Li Wei had dreamed of peace, the burdens of tax and opium weighed heavily. She watched her neighbors leave for the cities, hoping to find work in foreign warehouses. She watched her son grow older, his eyes hardening as he asked, "Why do we bow to men who do not speak our tongue?" She had no answer. She only held him close and whispered, "Remember who you are, even when they try to take it away." The empire that had called itself the center of the world now found itself divided, humiliated, and bleeding silver. But beneath the ashes, embers of resistance glowed. For every man who bent under the burden, another whispered of revenge. For every family that lost a child, another vowed to protect what remained. The treaty had ended a war, but it had sown the seeds of storms yet to come. The ink of the Treaty of Nanjing had barely dried when unrest began to ripple across the empire. For ordinary people, peace did not feel like peace. Instead of relief, they saw heavier taxes, more opium, and the humiliating presence of foreigners in their ports. The empire had been humbled abroad, and that humiliation seeped into every village, every marketplace, every shrine. Not in the southern provinces, whispers spread faster than fire. Farmers muttered that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, that heaven itself was angry. Floods ravaged the Yangtze Basin, locusts destroyed crops, and the tax collectors still came with iron demands. "We pay silver until our bowls are empty," one farmer in Guangxi complained. Yet the officials demand more, as if our bones could be ground into coin. It was in this atmosphere that strange prophets began to appear. One of them was a man named Hong Xiquan, a failed scholar who had once dreamed of passing the imperial examinations. After several humiliating failures, he claimed to have visions in which he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to cleanse China of corruption, idolatry, and foreign poison. His words were fiery, his presence magnetic. To peasants broken by poverty, his message was not madness but salvation. Hong preached that the Qing dynasty had forfeited heaven's favor. He called for the destruction of idols, the rejection of opium, and the creation of a new heavenly kingdom of equality. Families who had lost sons to war, who had sold daughters to taxes, who had seen their fields wither under flood waters, they flocked to him. His followers sang hymns not in Latin, but in Chinese, beating drums in the night, crying out, "The heavenly kingdom is coming." Among his early followers was a young woman named Li Fen, whose family had been ruined by both famine and opium. Her father, once a proud farmer, wasted away in smoke-filled dens, while her mother sold what little they had to buy rice. When she heard Hong speak, she felt as though a door had opened in the darkness. She joined his band of believers, carrying not a sword, but a banner painted with the words "Heavenly Peace." For the first time, she felt she belonged to something larger than despair. The Qing officials dismissed Hong at first, calling him a madman, a charlatan. But his movement grew like a storm cloud. By 1850, his followers numbered in the tens of thousands. They trained with stolen weapons, marched in disciplined ranks, and proclaimed their loyalty not to the emperor in Beijing, but to heaven's kingdom. Villages that once trembled under tax collectors now cheered as Hong's men drove them away. The rebellion erupted into open war in 1851. The Taiping, as they called themselves, clashed with imperial troops in Guangxi. To the shock of the empire, they won. More battles followed, and soon the Taiping controlled swathes of territory, their banners fluttering above cities once loyal to the king, Nanjing itself. The city where humiliation had been sealed by treaty fell to the Taiping in 1853. They renamed it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. Within its walls, Hong and his followers established their radical new order. Property was to be shared, opium banned, women allowed to serve as soldiers and officials. To many peasants, it was a vision of justice. To others, it was chaos, tearing apart traditions that had lasted for centuries. But for all its ideals, the Taiping regime was also ruthless. Suspected traitors were executed, dissent crushed. The heavenly capital glittered with hymns and proclamations. But in the countryside, villages were scorched by endless war. A farmer in Anhui recalled, "One year, the Taiping came, took our grain, and promised heaven. The next year, the king came, burned our homes, and promised loyalty. In the end, we were left with ashes from both. Still, the rebellion shook the dynasty to its core. Millions flocked to Hong's cause, believing he could deliver them from poverty and foreign domination. Imperial armies marched to crush him, but victory did not come easily. The war dragged on year after year, leaving rivers clogged with corpses and cities emptied by famine. By some counts, more than 20 million lives would be lost before the Taiping flame finally burned out. And yet, in the midst of blood and ruin, individuals still dreamed. Li Fen, who had joined as a girl, became a commander of a small band of women soldiers. She carried her banner into battle, her face scarred by fire, her eyes unbroken. To her comrades she said, "Even if we fall, the world will know we rose." Her fate was lost in the chaos, but her story lived in whispers for the king. The Taiping rebellion was both a nightmare and a mirror. It revealed their weakness, their failure to protect the people, their inability to reform. Foreign powers watched closely. Some even offered to help the king crush the Taiping, not out of love for the dynasty, but to preserve stability for trade. For Britain and France, China's chaos was opportunity. Thus, the fruits of the Treaty of Nanjing ripened into storm. What began as humiliation at foreign hands became rebellion at home. The dynasty fought for survival not only against the West, but against its own people. The century of humiliation was not only a story of invasions, it was also a story of fractures within, of an empire trembling under both foreign cannons and the cries of its own sons and daughters. The Qing dynasty emerged from the First Opium War wounded, but still standing. Yet the wound festered. The Treaty of Nanjing had forced concessions, but it had not satisfied Britain's appetite. In London, merchants spoke of opening China wider, and politicians debated how to extract even greater privileges from the faltering empire. The markets of tea, silk, and porcelain glittered with profit, but behind the polished mahogany tables of British firms lurked another hunger: opium. The Taiping Rebellion, which erupted in the early 1850s, further weakened the empire. For Western observers, the chaos was both terrifying and tempting. British and French officials wrote home that China was a house divided, ripe for deeper engagement. To them, instability was not a tragedy, but an opportunity. If the king could barely contain rebels, how could they resist the combined might of European empires? By the mid-1850s, tensions between China and Britain once again reached a breaking point. The immediate spark came in 1856 in Canton, where Chinese authorities boarded a ship called the Arrow, allegedly flying a British flag. The Chinese seized its crew, accusing them of piracy and smuggling. Britain claimed the incident violated the extraterritorial privileges granted by earlier treaties. The truth was murky. The ship's British registration had expired, and it was crewed mostly by Chinese sailors. But London seized upon the pretext. Once again, the thunder of gunboats echoed across the Pearl River. For ordinary people in Canton, it felt like the return of a nightmare they had barely begun to forget. Families fled the city as shells crashed into fortresses and homes alike. A young apprentice named Liang, who had once dreamed of becoming a silk merchant, carried his aged grandmother on his back through the smoke. "I do not know where we will go," he whispered, "only that we cannot stay around him." The air reeked of powder and burning wood, and the river was littered with debris from shattered junks. The war escalated quickly. Britain, joined this time by France, pressed their advantage. Their demands went beyond the Treaty of Nanjing. They wanted more ports, the right to station diplomats in Beijing, and full legalization of the opium trade. The king resisted, but their resistance was disorganized. Soldiers armed with spears and old matchlocks faced disciplined volleys and rifled cannons. At Guangzhou, the walls shook under bombardment, and when the city finally fell, the occupiers imposed their rule with brutal efficiency. In villages surrounding the city, people told stories of atrocities. An elderly teacher named Chen recounted how foreign soldiers stormed his school, scattering books and smashing inkstones. He tried to shield his pupils, but they beat him until his ribs cracked. "They wanted us to know," he said bitterly, "that their law was now stronger than ours." The king court, once again caught between pride and desperation, hesitated. Some officials urged immediate surrender, others demanded resistance at any cost. The emperor, cloistered in the forbidden city, performed rituals for heaven's favor, but offered little direction. Rumors spread that foreign armies might march all the way to Beijing, and fear clutched the capital. By 1858, the pressure forced the king to sign the treaties of Tianjin. These new agreements granted foreign diplomats access to Beijing, opened additional ports, allowed missionaries to travel freely, and, most devastatingly, legalized the opium trade. For Britain and France, it was a victory sealed in ink. For China, another deep wound. Yet peace did not hold. When the king later resisted the ratification of these treaties, the war reignited. In 1860, British and French forces advanced northward, capturing Tianjin and threatening the very gates of Beijing. Along the way, villages burned, crops were seized, and rivers ran with the cries of the displaced. The climax came with the looting and burning of the old summer palace, the Yuanming Yuan. This vast complex of palaces, gardens, and treasures have been called the Garden of Perfect Brightness, a jewel of Chinese civilization. Foreign soldiers ransacked it, seizing porcelain, silks, jade, and scrolls. Priceless works of art disappeared into the holds of European ships. When they were finished looting, they set fire to the rest. Flames devoured pavilions and libraries, smoke blotting out the sky. To the Chinese, it was not only a material loss, but a spiritual assault. an attempt to erase their culture's pride. A witness wrote, "The dragons carved in stone seemed to weep as the fire consumed them." Among the refugees of Beijing was a seamstress named Hua, who had sewn robes for minor officials. When the foreigners entered, she fled with her 2 young sons, leaving behind the tools of her craft. "My hands were for silk," she later told neighbors, "but now they only carry what we can eat." She never returned to her workshop. The palace ashes haunted her dreams. The Convention of Beijing in late 1860 sealed China's humiliation. Britain gained Kowloon, France secured more privileges, and the opium trade flowed without restraint. Russian envoys, watching from the north, extracted their own gains, vast tracts of land ceded along the Amur River. China was carved not by war alone, but by negotiation under the shadow of foreign guns. For common people, the consequences deepened their despair. Opium dens multiplied, their doors always open. In one alley of Shanghai, a boy named Yang watched his father sink into addiction. Night after night, he saw him lying on a bamboo mat, pipe in hand, eyes glazed. "He was alive," Yang recalled, "but he was not with us." The boy grew bitter, swearing he would never touch the poison that had stolen his father's soul. Yet even in this darkness, resistance flickered. Secret societies formed, pledging to drive out the foreigners. Some took up arms, raiding warehouses and burning opium stores. Others turned to the brush instead of the sword, writing poems and essays condemning both the dynasty and the invaders. A young scholar named Liang Qichao would later write that these humiliations were the seed of modern nationalism. That in fire and shame China was being forced away. The dynasty, however, remained trapped. The court continued to drown in ritual and intrigue, its officials more concerned with saving face than saving the people. Empress Dowager Cixi rose to prominence in these years, a woman whose ambition and cunning would shape the late king. But even she could not erase the scars left by the wars. The Second Opium War ended in treaties. But for the people, the war never truly ended. They lived the consequences every day. Higher taxes, eroded traditions, foreign soldiers patrolling their cities, and neighbors lost to opium smoke. Too many. It seemed that the empire of their ancestors was dying before their eyes, replaced by something hollow. Then beneath foreign will dot, and yet, beneath the sorrow, the question remained, could China endure? Could a civilization that had lasted for thousands of years rise again after being so deeply broken? The answers would not come quickly, but already, in whispers and rebellions, in hidden schools and secret vows, seeds of renewal were being sown, seeds that would take generations to bear fruit. The ashes of the Second Opium War did not settle quickly. For China, there was no time to breathe. The trees of Tianjin and Beijing had opened new wounds that bled into every corner of society. The empire, once proud, now bent under the weight of foreign demands. The phrase that later generations would call the century of humiliation was no abstraction for those who lived it. It was daily life. In the treaty ports, the changes were unmistakable. Shanghai became the most striking example. Along the Bund, foreign banks, warehouses, and mansions rose with astonishing speed. British, French, and American flags fluttered above concessions carved out like foreign islands in Chinese soil. Streets rang with languages that peasants from nearby villages could not understand. Rickshaw pullers carried pale-skinned merchants through avenues, where Chinese were forbidden to walk freely after dark for the wealthy elite. These changes brought both temptation and corruption. Some mandarins took bribes to protect foreign merchants or secure lucrative trade rights. They sent their sons to learn English, to study Western science, or to apprentice in foreign firms. A new class of compradors emerged, Chinese businessmen who acted as middlemen for foreign companies. They grew rich, buying estates and wearing Western suits, while their countrymen sold daughters to pay taxes. But for ordinary families, the foreign presence was like a storm tearing roofs from their homes. Taxes remained high, opium spread unchecked, and food prices soared. In one village outside Suzhou, A farmer named Han sold half his land to pay the indemnities demanded by the local magistrate. His wife begged him not to, but he sighed. If we do not pay, they will take everything. Within 2 years, he was a tenant on what had once been his own soil, owing to a landlord who profited from foreign silver. Missionaries came in increasing numbers. Some opened schools where children learned to read and write for the first time. Others built clinics, healing diseases that Chinese doctors could not cure. But their message was not only of charity, it was also of conversion. They condemned ancestral rites, declared temples to be false, and demanded the destruction of idols. Many villagers resisted fiercely. In Hunan, a missionary's attempt to smash a village shrine ended in blood when locals beat him and his assistants to death. In other places, desperate parents sent children to mission schools, torn between fear of betrayal and hunger for opportunity. The clash of cultures bred violence. Foreign missionaries, protected by extraterritorial rights, could not be tried under Chinese law. When disputes arose, a farmer accusing a missionary of stealing land, or a villager accusing foreign soldiers of assault, the cases evaporated into silence. Resentment boiled over. Secret societies like the Red Lanterns and Triads whispered of revenge, swearing oaths in candlelit rooms. Their blades pointed not only at corrupt mandarins, but at the foreigners who seemed untouchable. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the Forbidden City remained a theater of ritual and denial. The emperor was little more than a symbol, increasingly overshadowed by Empress Dowager Cixi, who maneuvered through intrigue with a cunning hand. She understood the need to balance foreign demands with survival, but her priority was always her own power. Funds meant for reform vanished into palace luxuries. Silver meant for troops was spent on marble halls. Soldiers marched hungry, while eunuchs carried treasures into the empress's chambers. Yet outside the palace, reformers were beginning to dream of something different. A small but growing number of scholars traveled abroad, or read translated works of Western science and politics. They asked dangerous questions. Why had the West grown so strong? Could China adopt their knowledge without losing its soul? One young scholar, King Yahweh, walked along the Bund in Shanghai and wrote in his diary, "The people of China are as capable as any. It is our system that chains us. If we do not change, we will be carved apart until nothing remains." His words were whispered in tea houses, copied in notebooks, smuggled across provinces at the same time. The countryside remained aflame with unrest. Banditry flourished, fueled by hunger and anger. In Sichuan, a bandit leader named Zhang roamed with a following of desperate peasants, attacking tax collectors and foreign merchants alike. To villagers, he was both savior and terror. Mothers prayed he would pass them by, while fathers whispered that at least someone still dared to resist. For families like May's, survival was a daily negotiation. She remembered the days of Li Wei, of the First War, when hope seemed fragile but real. Now, decades later, she watched her grandchildren grow up in a world where foreigners ruled the cities, and silver drained from the fields. Her eldest grandson, barely 16, dreamed of joining a secret society to fight the invaders. "Do not throw your life away," she warned him. He clenched his fist and said, "If we do nothing, we have no life at all." His words chilled her, for they carried both courage and the shadow of endless blood. Opium dens multiplied like weeds. In one alley of Guangzhou, a girl named Lin carried bowls of rice to her father, who spent his days sprawled on a mat. The smoke curled around his wasted body as she pleaded, "Please eat, father. Please remember us." But his eyes never lifted. In another quarter, wealthy merchants hosted banquets where opium pipes were passed as casually as wine cups, laughter mingling with the haze. The poison touched every level of society, from rickshaw pullers to princes. Foreign soldiers patrolled treaty ports, their uniforms stark against temple walls. Children pointed at them in fear, while elders spat in disgust. Yet some Chinese youths, fascinated, imitated their marches or tried to learn their words. The contradictions were everywhere: admiration and hatred, fear and desire, humiliation and awakening. By the 1870s, the phrase self-strengthening began to circulate. Reform-minded officials urged the dynasty to adopt Western technology, railways, factories, modern weapons, while preserving Confucian values. Shipyards were built, arsenals established, schools opened to teach science alongside classics. But corruption bled these efforts. Money vanished, projects stalled, and new ships rotted at anchor without coal. The people mocked the reforms, calling them foreign shells with Chinese souls empty inside. Still, the seeds were there. Beneath the weight of humiliation, the stirrings of modern China were beginning. Young men read forbidden books about republics and parliaments. Young women, inspired by missionaries or rebels, began to dream of education and roles beyond the loom. Peasants prayed for heaven's justice, while merchants whispered of revolution. The empire was cracked, but through the cracks, light struggled to enter. And so, the century of humiliation deepened. It was no single moment, no single war, but a chain of degradations, each linked to the next. For the people, it was not history, but life. The sound of foreign boots on stone streets, the smell of opium smoke in the alleys, the sight of their children bowling to strangers. For the empire, it was a slow drowning. And yet, in the hearts of those who suffered most, there remained a stubborn belief that China's story was not finished, that even in humiliation, the dream of renewal would one day rise. Up by the last decades of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty was like a massive tree hollowed by rot. Outwardly, its branches still reached toward the heavens, leaves still shimmered in the sun. But within, decay spread silently. The humiliation of the Opium Wars had not healed. Instead, it had deepened, joined now by new wounds carved by other foreign powers. The first and most shocking of these new blows came not from Europe, but from across the sea. Japan, once a tributary state that had bowed to the Middle Kingdom, had transformed itself through the Meiji Restoration. While China clung to its old ways, Japan had studied the West, adopted modern armies, built railroads, and forged factories. By the 1890s, Japan stood as a rising power, eager to test its strength. The spark was Korea, long a tributary of the Qing. Both Japan and China claimed influence there. But when tensions flared, it was Japan who struck first. The First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95 was brief but catastrophic for the Qing. Chinese troops marched bravely, but they were poorly armed, poorly led, and poorly supplied. Japanese forces, disciplined and modern, swept through Korea and into Manchuria. At the Battle of the Yalu River, Chinese ships, many bought with borrowed silver, faced the Imperial Japanese Navy. Within hours, the fleet was shattered, smoke rising from burning decks, sailors leaping into the cold sea. News of the defeat spread like wildfire. In tea houses, men shook their heads in disbelief. We once called Japan our younger brother. Now he beats us like a master. The war ended with the Treaty of Shimonoseki. China ceded Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula, paid a vast indemnity, and recognized Korea's independence, though in truth, Korea slipped quickly into Japan's grasp. To ordinary people, these words meant little until the consequences reached their homes. Taxes rose yet again. Families who had survived the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion now found themselves selling heirlooms, or laboring twice as hard to feed the empire's debts. In Shandong, an old farmer named Liu sighed as he sold his last ox. This beast plowed my fields for 20 years. Now it goes to pay for a war we never saw. Foreign powers circled like vultures around a dying beast. Seeing China's weakness, Germany seized Qingdao. Russia pressed into Manchuria. France expanded in the south, and Britain tightened its grip on Hong Kong and the Yangtze Valley. Maps drawn in European capitals carved China into spheres of influence. To the people, it seemed as though the very land beneath their feet was being divided without their voice. The treaty ports swelled with foreign wealth. In Shanghai, electric lamps lit the foreign concessions while Chinese neighborhoods remained dark. Trains carried opium, cotton, and tea to the docks, while peasants in the hinterland starved. Missionaries preached in new churches, their bells clashing with the gongs of temples. Children from poor families sometimes attended mission schools, where they learned English prayers alongside mathematics. Some parents welcomed this as opportunity. Others muttered that their sons and daughters were being stolen in spirit. Resentment grew. In the countryside, whispers turned into fists. The Boxer movement began as a blend of martial arts, folk religion, and desperation. Men trained in courtyards, believing that with rituals and faith they could become invulnerable to bullets. Women joined too, some calling themselves the Red Lanterns, swearing to drive out the foreigners with fire. The movement spread like wildfire across northern China in 1899. Villagers, who had long suffered under drought, famine, and the arrogance of missionaries, now found hope in the Boxers' cry: support the king, destroy the foreign. Too many. It was not just rebellion, it was survival. They tore down telegraph poles, attacked churches, and besieged foreign compounds. Among them was a young man named Zhang Wei, whose family had lost 3 children to famine. He trained at night, fists striking wooden posts until his knuckles bled. "The foreigners take our land, our silver, our gods," he said to his companions. "If heaven will not protect us, then we will become heaven's fists." At first, king officials hesitated. Some saw the Boxers as dangerous rebels, others as a possible tool. Empress Dowager Cixi, ever calculating, eventually threw her support behind them, declaring war on the foreign powers in 1900. It was a decision born of pride and desperation. The 8-nation alliance, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States, Japan, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, responded with overwhelming force. Their armies marched through Tianjin and into Beijing. The Boxers fought bravely but fell in droves. Rituals could not stop bullets, and faith could not halt cannon fire. Cities burned, fields were trampled, and once again, refugees flooded the roads. Beijing itself became a battlefield. The foreign legations, besieged by Boxers and king troops, held out until reinforcements stormed the city. When the foreigners broke through, looting followed. Temples were plundered, women assaulted, treasures carried off. The forbidden city itself trembled as Empress Dowager Cixi fled disguised as a peasant. Her jewels hidden in baskets of rice, ordinary families bore the brunt. In one hutong of Beijing, a seamstress named Yan hid her children beneath the floorboards as foreign soldiers ransacked homes. She whispered prayers, clutching a needle as her only weapon. "If they find us," she told her daughter, "we will fight with what we have." The soldiers passed her door, but her fear lingered for the rest of her life. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposed crushing terms. Huge indemnities were demanded, foreign troops stationed permanently in Beijing, and further concessions carved from China's sovereignty. It was another chain in the long line of humiliations, another wound for a people already scarred. Yet even amid defeat, something shifted. The blood of the Boxers, though spilled in vain, awakened a sense of national consciousness. People who had once identified only with village or clan now spoke of China as a whole. The humiliation was unbearable, but it lit a fire. A new generation began to ask, how long can this last? What must change? In Hunan, a school teacher named Chen Duxiu taught his pupils not only Confucian classics but also translation. S. of Rousseau and Lincoln. "The world is wide," he told them. "We are not lesser than others, but we are chained by our own corruption. If we do not awaken, we will vanish." His students listened with wide eyes, some whispering of revolution, others daring to dream of a republic. The Qing dynasty staggered into the 20th century, propped up by foreign guns and drained by foreign debts. But beneath the suffering, the dream of renewal stirred. In alleyways and classrooms, in secret societies and families scarred by war, the old order was breaking. The dragon was wounded, but not dead. and in its pain, a new China was struggling to be born. The dawn of the 20th century arrived, but for China, it did not bring light. Instead, the empire staggered like an old man leaning on a crumbling staff. The Qing dynasty, once the Middle Kingdom's proud guardian, now seemed a relic. Foreign powers carved deeper into its flesh, demanding concessions, building railways under their control, and seizing customs revenues as collateral for endless loans. Ordinary people felt the weight of this decay. Taxes pressed harder, while floods and famines continued to strike. In Henan, a mother named Liu carried her two children to a missionary clinic after drought killed their crops. She wept with gratitude when they were given rice. But at night she whispered to her husband, "They feed us, but they also take our souls." Her words captured the dilemma of millions. To survive often meant to bow down at the same time. The dynasty's own corruption deepened. Officials enriched themselves by collaborating with foreign investors. Grand mansions rose in Beijing and Shanghai, funded by silver siphoned from peasants. Soldiers went unpaid, their rifles rusting, while eunuchs carried jewels through palace corridors. Too many. The Forbidden City became a symbol not of strength but of suffocation. A prison of gold while the nation starved. But amid despair, seeds of change were sprouting. Overseas Chinese communities in Japan, Southeast Asia, and the United States sent money and ideas back home. Students studied Western science, politics, and military tactics. They returned with dangerous dreams of republics, of parliaments, of nations where rulers served the people, not the other way around. The most famous of these dreamers was Sun Yat-sen. Born in Guangdong to a poor farming family, he traveled abroad, studied medicine in Hong Kong, and saw firsthand how far China lagged behind the modern world. He concluded that the Qing dynasty was beyond saving. "China is sick," he declared, "and the king are the disease. To cure the nation, we must cut out the rot." Sun founded revolutionary societies, gathering exiles and patriots. They were small at first, scattered cells meeting in tea houses or rented rooms, swearing oaths over flickering candles. But their vision spread. In villages, peasants whispered his name. In cities, students passed pamphlets hidden in their sleeves. Even soldiers, tired of unpaid wages, began to listen. The Boxer defeat had convinced many that relying on the king to defend China was hopeless. The dynasty had allied with desperation and then collapsed under foreign boots. Now the people's anger turned not just against the foreigners, but against their own rulers. Secret societies, the Tongminghui, the Jelahui, the Green Gang fused patriotism with rebellion. They raised money through extortion and smuggling, funneled weapons into the interior, and plotted uprisings. One such uprising came in 1911 in Wuchang. Soldiers there, inspired by revolutionary whispers, mutinied. At first, it was confusion. A gun discharged accidentally, plans exposed prematurely. But within days, the spark became a fire. Provinces declared independence one by one, governors switching allegiance to the revolution rather than risk isolation. For the first time in centuries, the dragon's grip slipped in Beijing. Panic spread. The court, dominated by Empress Dowager Long Yu after Sixi's death, debated desperately. Some officials argued for crushing the rebels, others urged negotiation. But the dynasty's strength was gone. Armies that once marched proudly now hesitated, unsure whether to fight or defect. For ordinary people, the revolution felt both terrifying and exhilarating. In a village near Wuhan, a blacksmith named Zhao forged crude blades for the rebels. He told his sons, "We have bowed all our lives. Perhaps in their time, they will stand straight." In Shanghai, students raised red flags in the streets, chanting for a republic. Shopkeepers closed their doors, unsure whether they faced mobs or freedom. By early 1912, the Qing dynasty crumbled. The last emperor, a child named Pui, was forced to abdicate. His tiny hands signed away a throne that had stood for more than 2 millennia. The dragon banner was lowered, and in its place rose a new flag, the flag of the Republic of China. The moment was both triumph and tragedy. For some, it was the long-awaited rebirth. No more emperors cloaked in ritual. No more kotos before a throne. For others, it was chaos. The collapse of the only system they had ever known. In Beijing, an old man wept as he watched the imperial guards depart. I was born in the dragon's shadow. Now the shadow is gone. What will protect us? But the revolution could not erase the scars of the century that came before. Foreign soldiers still patrolled treaty ports. Indemnity still drained silver. Warlords soon carved the new republic into fragments. Yet, for the first time in generations, there was also hope. Hope that humiliation might one day be overcome. In Guangzhou, a school teacher gathered her pupils and told them, "You were born in a broken world, but broken things can be mended. Remember this day. Remember that China can rise again." Her students repeated the words, not fully understanding, but sensing that history had turned. The century of humiliation had not ended, but its deepest wound, the belief that China could never change, was beginning to heal. The dragon had fallen, but from its ashes, something new struggled to breathe. The abdication of the child Emperor Pui in early 1912 did not bring peace to China. The empire had collapsed, but what replaced it was fragile, uncertain, and contested at every level. For the first time in centuries, the people of China no longer bowed before an imperial throne. Yet instead of a single guiding hand, they faced a storm of competing powers. Sun Yat-sen, hailed as the father of the republic, briefly assumed the presidency. In Nanjing, crowds gathered in the streets to cheer, raising red banners and beating drums. Students read his proclamations aloud in marketplaces, promising liberty, equality, and the rebirth of a nation humiliated for a century. For a moment, hope soared. But hope is fragile when built upon broken foundations. The Republic was not united. The North remained under the sway of Yuan Shikai, a former king general who commanded the Beiying army, the most modern and disciplined force in China. Yuan was ambitious, cunning, and more loyal to his own power than to any vision of national rebirth. Sun Yat-sen, realizing that the revolutionaries could not match Yuan's armies, reluctantly yielded the presidency to him in exchange for the emperor's abdication. It was a gamble, and for many, it felt like betrayal. Ordinary people soon discovered that a change of banners did not always mean a change of life. In villages of Hunan and Sichuan, peasants still paid crushing taxes. Bandits roamed the countryside, extorting protection fees from farmers. In the cities, new officials sat where king magistrates once had, demanding bribes in exchange for justice. A farmer named Zhao in Shaanxi sighed, "The dragon is gone, but the wolf has come." His words spread in tea houses as a bitter proverb. Yuan Shikai betrayed the fragile dream of republicanism almost at once. In 1915, he declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Hongshan. He commissioned new regalia, planned lavish coronation ceremonies, and distributed titles to supporters. But the country mocked him. Students published cartoons showing Yuan with the body of a pig in an emperor's robe. Provincial leaders, fearing his overreach, declared independence. Facing rebellion, Yuan abandoned his throne after only 83 days. His humiliation was complete, and within a year, he was dead. After his death, China entered what historians would later call the warlord era. From 1916 onward, the country fractured into provinces controlled by rival generals. Some commanded disciplined armies, others mere bands of looters. Each carved out their own fiefdom, levying taxes, issuing currency, and waging wars against neighbors. In Shandong, peasants remembered the cruelty of Zhang Zongchang, the dog-meat general infamous for his brutality and excesses. He traveled with a personal harem, a white Russian bodyguard, and a train filled with liquor and gambling tables. His soldiers looted villages, carrying off food, daughters, and livestock. He was not a man, one survivor later said, but a plague with boots. Yet in this chaos, new ideas still spread. In 1919, after the Treaty of Versailles transferred German concessions in Shandong to Japan rather than returning them to China, students in Beijing erupted in protest. They marched through the streets shouting, "Down with imperialism! Down with warlords!" This became the May 4th movement, a turning point where Chinese youth embraced modern nationalism, science, and calls for cultural renewal. Among those students was a young man named Chen, who later recalled, "We carried no guns, only books and our voices. But for the first time, I felt the strength of a nation, not of an emperor or a general, but of ordinary people who refused to kneel." Meanwhile, for families in rural China, survival remained precarious. A widow named Mei in Hunan buried the sons lost to famine and whispered prayers over her only surviving daughter. When foreign missionaries offered food in exchange for baptism, she accepted, though she confessed to neighbors, "I believe not in their God, but in rice." Her story echoed the daily compromises made by millions. Torn between hunger and pride, foreign powers continued to exploit China's weakness. Japan's 21 demands in 1915 forced economic and territorial concessions. British, French, and American companies still profited from treaty ports. Russia meddled from the north, supporting rival factions. Too many Chinese. It seemed the century of humiliation had not ended with the fall of the king, but had only deepened out. Yet even in this fragmented, battered land, hope survived. Intellectuals translated Marx, Rousseau, and Darwin. Peasants whispered of land reform. Merchants dreamed of industries that would free them from foreign goods. A seed was planted, watered by anger and despair, that one day China could stand not as a carved carcass for empires, but as a nation reborn. The question remained, who would nurture that seed? The death of Yuan Shikai in 1916 did not stabilize China. It shattered what fragile unity the republic had possessed. With the collapse of central authority, generals, once subordinate to Beijing, seized control of provinces as their private kingdoms. Each man crowned himself with power, not with legitimacy, but with the barrel of a gun. The country fractured into a patchwork of warlord states. In the north, the Beiying generals squabbled among themselves, dividing Beijing's government into cliques. In the west, isolated strongmen ruled valleys with personal armies loyal only to their purses. In the south, revolutionary leaders still spoke of republican ideals, but even their banners could not conceal the reality of violence and extortion. For ordinary people, the warlord era was not measured in treaties or speeches, but in raids, famine, and fear. Armies marched back and forth across provinces, requisitioning grain, conscripting young men, and burning villages suspected of harboring rivals. The peasant proverb of the age was bitter. One day bandits, the next day soldiers. Both eat our rice. In Shandong, villagers told of Zhang Zongchang, the infamous dog meat general. Towering, coarse, and brutal, he was a man whose appetites matched his cruelty. He boasted of keeping concubines from across the world, Chinese, Russian, Japanese, and traveled with them on a private train laden with gambling tables and crates of liquor. His soldiers followed his example, plundering towns, violating women, and demanding taxes at sword point. Survivors remembered how Zhang once ordered artillery to shell a village, simply because its people refused to provide more grain. Yet not all warlords were monsters in the same mold. In Manchuria, Zhang Zuolin styled himself as the Old Marshal. Though ruthless in consolidating power, he also encouraged railways and limited modernization, seeking Japanese backing to strengthen his rule. In Yunnan, local leaders sometimes invested in schools, hoping to win loyalty through limited reform rather than terror. But even these better rulers were warlords still. Their motives were rooted in survival, not in serving the people. The endless conflicts devastated agriculture. Fields lay fallow as farmers fled advancing armies. In Hunan, an old farmer named Gur buried his iron plow under a tree before fleeing with his family. "Better the earth eat it," he muttered, "than the soldiers. For years afterward, he wandered from village to village, a refugee in his own land. Clutching a bundle of seeds he hoped one day to plant again. In the cities, life was no less uncertain. Merchants were squeezed by competing factions demanding bribes. A silk shop owner in Suzhou recounted paying taxes 3 times in 1 month. Once to the local magistrate, once to a passing general, and once to a bandit gang that claimed to be patriots. He closed his shop after soldiers carried off bolts of fabric without payment, muttering, "Better moths eat silk than thieves in uniform." Amid this chaos, intellectuals and students sought a new path. The May 4th movement of 1919 had already awakened many to the idea that China's weakness stemmed not only from foreign aggression, but from internal decay. Now, groups of young activists gathered in universities and tea houses, debating Marx, Confucius, and Western science. They dreamed of a China free of warlords and foreign chains, though their visions differed sharply. Some believed in liberal democracy, others in socialism, still others in a return to moral order rooted in ancient traditions. For many students, books became their only weapon. In Beijing, a young woman named Lin risked arrest by distributing pamphlets calling for women's education and equality. If China is a family, she argued, then half of its children are locked away in ignorance. Her courage inspired peers, though it also drew the anger of conservative elders. At home, her father shouted, "A girl's place is in the kitchen, not in politics." Lin only replied, "If the kitchen burns, should we not all try to put out the fire?" Meanwhile, rural resistance took cruder forms. Secret societies armed with spears and hunting rifles attacked tax collectors and burned government granaries. They were crushed brutally, yet new groups emerged again and again. Some invoked the spirits of past dynasties, believing that heaven itself would one day punish the corrupt rulers. Others spoke of revolution, though often without clear direction. Foreign powers exploited the disunity. Japan tightened its grip on Manchuria, building railways and garrisons. Western companies expanded trade concessions in Shanghai and Tianjin, paying off whichever general controlled the ports. Missionaries spread Christianity deeper into rural areas, sometimes offering medicine and food, sometimes provoking resentment. To peasants, the warlords and the foreigners seemed indistinguishable. Both were outsiders who drained China's strength. The cultural life of the nation also reflected its turmoil. Newspapers printed lurid tales of warlord excess, fueling public outrage. Writers like Lu Xun captured the despair of the age, describing peasants who lived like ghosts, neither alive nor fully dead. His short stories spread far beyond intellectual circles, echoing the frustrations of millions who had no voice. Amid the darkness, some seeds of unity began to form. In 1921, in a small house in Shanghai, 13 men gathered to found the Chinese Communist Party. Their numbers were tiny, their resources meager, but they shared a conviction that China could be remade through the power of workers and peasants. At the same time, the Nationalist Party Kuomintang, inspired by Sun Yat-sen, reorganized with the dream of finally unifying the country. These two movements, though different in ideology, both sought to end the warlord nightmare. For ordinary people, however, such political visions remained distant. A widow in Sichuan, watching her eldest son conscripted by one faction and her youngest seized by another, wept. Rebels, warlords, Republicans, they all take sons, and none return. Her lament was shared in countless households, where the line between patriot and predator blurred into nothing. By the mid-1920s, the exhaustion of the people grew palpable. The endless wars, the famine, the humiliations of foreign concessions, all combined to create a hunger not just for food, but for order. As one peasant put it bluntly, "We care not who rules, only that we may plant in spring and harvest in autumn." By the mid-1920s, the people of China had grown weary of endless wars and the predations of warlords. Farmers whispered of planting but never harvesting. Merchants counted coins only to see them seized by armed men. and parents watched sons marched away in ragged uniforms. The hunger for stability had become overwhelming, and into this hunger stepped a fragile hope. The idea that China could be reunited. Sun Yat-sen, though weakened by illness, worked tirelessly to lay the foundation for such a vision. He reorganized the Kuomintang Nationalist Party, forging alliances with students, merchants, and even foreign advisors. Recognizing that the warlords' private armies could not be defeated with scattered rebels alone, he accepted assistance from an unlikely partner, the Soviet Union. Soviet advisors provided training, funds, and blueprints for building a disciplined revolutionary army. Alongside them, a fledgling group of Chinese communists, still numbering only in the hundreds, joined the Kuomintang in what was called the First United Front. When Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, his mantle passed to Chiang Kai-shek, a soldier hardened by military training in Japan and service under the revolutionary banners. Chiang was ambitious, stern, and unyielding. He took command of the National Revolutionary Army and prepared for the Great Campaign, known as the Northern Expedition, whose purpose was simple in name, but vast in scope, to crush the warlords and unify China under one banner. The campaign began in 1926. Columns of soldiers marched northward, their rifles outdated but their discipline new. Alongside them walked barefoot peasants carrying supplies, students shouting slogans, and workers who had struck against local warlords. Down with the generals, down with corruption, long live the Republic. These cries echoed through towns that had known nothing but shifting banners for a decade. At first, victories came quickly. In Hunan, peasants opened their gates to the advancing nationalists, offering rice and water to the soldiers. They tore down the warlords' proclamations and hung red banners in the marketplaces. A school teacher named Zhu gathered his students and whispered, "This may be the first day in your lives when China is more than a dream." But the path to unity was not simple. Many warlords switched sides rather than fight, bargaining with Chiang to keep their titles in exchange for allegiance. Thus, the unification was often as much negotiation as it was battle. Still, for ordinary people, the sight of a single flag spreading across provinces felt like deliverance. Amid the march, communists worked feverishly to expand their influence. They organized peasants into unions, redistributed seized grain, and promised land reform. In villages of Jiangxi, poor farmers who had lived under crushing rents danced in celebration as they received plots of soil. A gray-haired woman, clutching a hoe, said through tears, "For 50 years I bent my back for others. Today, the earth is finally mine." These radical changes frightened landlords and conservative officials within the Kuomintang. To them, the communists were sowing chaos beneath the surface of unity. Chiang himself grew suspicious. Though he relied on Soviet aid and communist enthusiasm, he distrusted their ideology. His vision of China was authoritarian, nationalist, and centralized, not revolutionary redistribution. By the time the expedition reached Shanghai in 1927, the alliance fractured. The city was a cauldron of tension. Workers staged strikes, communists armed themselves, and foreigners guarded their concessions. When the nationalist forces entered, Chiang made his decision. He ordered a bloody purge of communists and leftist sympathizers. What followed became known as the Shanghai Massacre. Soldiers stormed union halls, dragging activists into the streets. Gunfire echoed through alleys, and blood stained the pavements where workers had once chanted for liberation. A young seamstress named Lan, who had joined the union hoping for fair wages, was seized by soldiers and executed along with hundreds of others. Her sister later recalled, she dreamed of bread and dignity. They gave her bullets instead. The fragile unity of the First United Front shattered. Communists fled into the countryside, pursued by nationalist armies. Many were killed, others captured, and some, like Mao Zedong, who had been organizing peasants in Hunan, slipped into hiding, convinced that the struggle for China would now be fought not in cities but in the villages, among the farmers who made up the nation's heart. Yet even as blood soaked the soil, the northern expedition continued. Chiang's forces pressed onward, toppling warlords province by province. By 1928, Beijing itself fell, and the warlord era seemed to draw to a close. The nationalist government declared Nanjing its capital, and for the first time in decades, China was nominally unified under one authority. But unity born in blood carried its own curses. The communists, though weakened, were not destroyed. In the countryside, they rebuilt in secret, vowing revenge. The landlords, though shaken, still clung to their estates. The warlords, though defeated, often re-emerged as allies or governors under the nationalists. And the foreign powers, watching from their concessions, still wielded enormous influence over trade, ports, and loans. For the people of China, the warlord banners may have disappeared, but the hunger for true justice, dignity, and independence remained unfulfilled. A student in Shanghai wrote in his diary in 1928, "The flags have changed, but the questions have not. Who feeds the hungry? Who frees the poor? Who speaks for the people?" The northern expedition ended the warlord chaos, but it began a new struggle. A struggle not between generals, but between visions of what China could become. The year was 1928. The dragon flag of the king was long gone. The banners of the warlords had been toppled, and the nationalist government in Nanjing proclaimed itself the sole legitimate authority of China. To the outside world, it seemed that the chaos had ended. Foreign diplomats exchanged handshakes with Chiang Kai-shek. Investors spoke of stability returning, and newspapers in London and New York wrote headlines declaring, "China united at last." But for the people who lived in the villages, towns, and fields of China, unity was an illusion. The warlords were not gone. Many had merely switched uniforms and pledged temporary loyalty to the nationalists. Landlords still squeezed peasants for rent. Foreign powers still held their treaty ports and extracted wealth. And in the shadows, the communists, bloodied but unbroken, regrouped. Chiang Kai-shek's government in Nanjing began with promise. Railways were expanded, tariffs reformed, and attempts made to modernize the currency. Schools were built in some provinces, and young people learned not only Confucian classics but also modern science. A new anthem was sung, pledging loyalty to the Republic. Yet for all these gestures, corruption gnawed at the system. Officials demanded bribes, governors favored relatives, and the divide between city and countryside widened. For the peasants, the backbone of the nation, little changed. In Hunan, a tenant farmer named Liu tilled the same plot of land his father had before him, handing over half his harvest to the landlord. He had cheered when the nationalist army marched through, promising reform. But after they left, the rent collector returned as always, his ledger thicker than ever. The faces changed. Liu sighed to his wife, but the hands that take our rice are the same. It was among these peasants that the communists rebuilt. Driven into hiding after the Shanghai massacre, leaders like Mao Zedong, Zhu Di, and Zhou Enlai began to rethink their strategy. No longer would they try to seize power in the cities, where they had been crushed. Instead, they turned to the countryside, where 80% of China's people lived, where hunger was deepest, and where hope still flickered in the hills of Jiangxi. They established what became known as the Jiangxi Soviet. There, land was seized from landlords and redistributed to the poor. Schools were open, teaching not only literacy, but also revolutionary songs. Soldiers of the Red Army drilled barefoot in the mud, carrying rifles older than themselves. Yet their morale was higher than that of many warlord troops. Life in the Soviet was not easy, but it was different. A widow named Chen, whose husband had been beaten to death by rent collectors years earlier, was given a small patch of land. She harvested grain with her children and for the first time in her life kept what she grew. "The earth is finally ours," she whispered as she dug her hands into the soil. For her, and thousands like her, the communists were not abstract ideologues but bringers of justice. Chiang saw them as a cancer. Determined to root out this threat, he launched a series of encirclement campaigns. sending waves of nationalist troops to crush the Soviets. Entire villages suspected of aiding the communists were burned. Refugees streamed through the countryside, carrying stories of atrocities. Men executed, women assaulted, fields salted with fire. Yet the communists adapted. They used guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and retreating into the hills. Their knowledge of the terrain and the loyalty of peasants who sheltered them allowed them to survive against overwhelming odds. The Red Army's discipline stood in stark contrast to the looting of many nationalist units. A villager recalled, "Chiang's soldiers took our pigs and rice. The Reds gave us a few coins for eggs." Who was the bandit and who was the army? In the cities, meanwhile, Chiang attempted to consolidate his rule. He sought support from businessmen, bankers, and landlords, promising stability. Shanghai glittered with jazz clubs, neon lights, and skyscrapers rising beside ancient temples. Foreigners danced to American music in ballrooms, while in alleyways children starved. The gap between the modern Fuwade and the suffering masses grew ever wider. Students and intellectuals increasingly turned away from the nationalists. Some joined underground communist cells, while others fled abroad, writing scathing essays about corruption and betrayal. A student in Beijing wrote in his diary, "We thought we were building a republic. Instead, we have built a cage with painted bars." The conflict between the nationalists and communists was not merely political. It was a war for the soul of China. One vision sought to modernize while preserving hierarchy. Another sought to overturn society itself. Both claimed to represent the people, yet both demanded sacrifices beyond endurance. By the early 1930s, the fighting reached a fever pitch. The Jiangxi Soviet had grown into a state within a state, with millions of peasants under communist administration. Chiang launched massive campaigns to annihilate it, deploying blockhouses and cutting off supply lines. Famine returned to the countryside as armies consumed the harvest. For families caught in the middle, survival was the only goal. A young girl named May carried water to both Red soldiers and nationalist troops, lying to each side about where her loyalties lay. "I served whoever was at my door," she recalled years later, "because what I wanted was not freedom or ideology, but to keep my mother alive." But the hammer of Chiang's campaigns grew heavier. By 1934, the Red Army could no longer hold Jiangxi. Surrounded and outnumbered, they made a desperate decision to break out and march thousands of miles in search of safety. What followed would become one of the most legendary journeys in modern history, the Long March. By the mid-1930s, the Long March had ended, but the struggle for China had not. The communists, battered and diminished, found a fragile refuge in the northern province of Shaanxi. There, in caves carved into the yellow Loess cliffs around Yan'an, they rebuilt their strength. The survivors of the march, hardened by a year of suffering, now became legends among their followers. Mao Zedong, once just one leader among many, emerged as the dominant voice. He argued that the revolution's heart was not in the cities but in the villages, not in workers' strikes but in the endurance of peasants. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government in Nanjing faced challenges of their own. Although they had unified China on paper, in reality the country remained fractured. Corruption drained resources, landlords resisted reform, and resentment simmered. Chiang focused his energies on crushing the communists, launching campaigns to strangle their Shaanxi base. But while he fought fellow Chinese, a storm gathered in the east. Japan, already entrenched in Manchuria since 1931, looked hungrily upon the rest of China. Japanese leaders spoke openly of creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which in practice meant domination of China's resources, markets, and people. Skirmishes flared along the borders, but in July 1937, at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing, a clash between Japanese and Chinese troops escalated into full-scale war. The invasion was swift and merciless. Japanese armies, well-equipped and modernized, poured across northern China. Cities fell like dominoes: Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, And finally, in December 1937, Nanjing. What followed there would scar the nation's soul forever. The rape of Nanjing was not a battle, but a slaughter. For 6 weeks, Japanese troops turned the ancient capital into a charnel house. Soldiers stormed homes, dragged men into the streets, and executed them in mass shootings. Women, from grandmothers to children, were subjected to systematic rape, often killed afterward to silence their screams. Fires consumed neighborhoods, and bodies floated in the Yangtze River like broken branches. Survivors remember the city as a nightmare of smoke, blood, and silence where temples echoed with weeping. One survivor, a school teacher named Li Hua, later wrote, "I taught my pupils to recite poems of loyalty and honor. But in those days, there were no poems, only screams. I buried 3 of my students with my own hands. They had no more future than the ashes of their books." The world looked on in shock. But the war raged on. Millions fled the occupied zones, streaming into the countryside as refugees. Entire families carried what little they could. Bundles of grain, a chicken in a basket, a single quilt to share. Roads filled with columns of displaced souls, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. In the countryside, the communists seized their chance, while the nationalists bore the brunt of pitched battles against Japanese armies. The communists spread through villages, organizing resistance, teaching peasants to fight with ambushes and sabotage. They built tunnels, struck supply lines, and vanished into the hills. For peasants, the contrast was stark. Nationalist troops often seized their grain, while Red Army units made a show of paying, even if with scraps of paper promises. In one village in Hebei, an old woman named Zhao remembered how communist fighters helped her rebuild her roof. After a bombing, "They slept on the dirt like us," she said. "They ate sorghum gruel like us. They called me Annie. Chang's soldiers called me peasant." But the war spared no one. In 1938, the nationalists made a desperate move to slow the Japanese advance. They breached the dikes of the Yellow River, flooding vast areas of Hunan, Anhui, and Jiangsu. The flood waters swallowed thousands of villages, killing hundreds of thousands outright and displacing millions more. Refugees clung to rafts of reeds, floating over the fields where they once harvested wheat. A farmer named Yu, watching his home sink beneath the muddy waters, spat bitterly, "The Japanese burn us, Chang drowns us. Who is left to save us?" Despite such sacrifices, the Japanese pressed on. By 1940, they occupied much of the Chinese coast and key cities. Puppet governments were installed, their officials parroting slogans of cooperation while serving the occupiers. Yet resistance never ceased. Guerrilla bands harassed the enemy, students staged protests, and underground newspapers carried news of defiance. The suffering was immense. Famine stalked Hunan in 1942, where drought and war stripped the land bare. Peasants ate bark, clay, and even the corpses of animals that lay in the roads. Mothers carried skeletal children to relief stations, only to find nothing left but empty bins. One villager recalled, "We prayed for death to come quickly. It was kinder than life." And yet, amid the ashes, solidarity flickered. A Red Army nurse named May risked her life to smuggle medicine into villages under occupation, treating both peasants and wounded guerrillas. In her diary, she wrote, "Every face I save is a strike against despair. Every bandage is a promise that China is not finished." By the mid-1940s, the war dragged into its 8th year. Villages were emptied, cities scarred, and tens of millions dead or displaced. But Japan itself began to falter as the wider world war consumed it. The American bombing of Japanese cities, the battles in the Pacific, and finally the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Tokyo's surrender in 1945. For China, the war's end was bittersweet. Foreign invaders were gone, but the land lay shattered. Fields lay untended, families torn apart, and entire provinces reduced to rubble. And as the smoke cleared, the old conflict between nationalists and communists paused but never ended. Reignited with fury. The surrender of Japan in August 1945 was supposed to bring peace to China, but instead it reopened old wounds. For 8 years, the country had fought a merciless invader, but now the two rival Chinese forces, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists, turned their weapons back on each other. The uneasy united front that had held them together against Japan collapsed like a brittle shell. China in 1945 was a nation in ruins. Cities lay shattered by bombings, villages emptied by famine, railways twisted and broken, and more than 20 million people dead. Families were scattered. Refugees still wandered the countryside in ragged lines. Fields lay fallow, weeds choking what had once been fertile rice paddies. And into this desolate land marched two armies, both claiming to fight for China's future. The nationalists, backed by the United States, had the larger army and better weapons. They held the major cities, the ports, the arsenals. American planes airlifted entire divisions of nationalist troops to reclaim territory from retreating Japanese forces. Chiang, confident of victory, believed the communists could be crushed once and for all. The communists, however, had what the nationalists lacked: the loyalty of millions of peasants in the countryside. During the years of Japanese occupation, the communists had expanded their influence quietly, village by village, through patient organizing and guerrilla war. Their leaders promised land reform, an end to landlord abuse, and a government that spoke for the poor, for peasants who had lost everything to war. Such promises were powerful. The Civil War began in earnest in 1946. At first, the nationalists struck hard. Using American-trained divisions, they captured key cities in northern China, driving the communists from Manchuria and encircling them in the plains. For a moment, it seemed Chiang's dream of unifying China under his rule would finally be realized. But beneath the surface, his government was rotting. Corruption was rampant. Officials grew rich skimming from aid shipments while ordinary people starved. Inflation soared, wiping out the savings of shopkeepers and clerks. In Shanghai, a loaf of bread cost a day's wages, then two, then a week's. Mothers pawned family heirlooms just to buy a bowl of rice. In the countryside, nationalist soldiers often requisitioned food without payment, leaving peasants bitter and hungry. One peasant in Shandong later recalled, "When the nationalists came, they took our pigs, our grain, even our tools. When the communists came, they asked us to share, but they also gave us land. Who do you think we trusted?" By 1947, the tide began to shift. The communists reorganized and rearmed, launched counterattacks in Manchuria. There, they found fertile ground, factories abandoned by the Japanese, railroads to move troops, and peasants eager for revenge against landlords who had collaborated with occupiers. Whole regiments of nationalist soldiers defected, bringing their weapons with them. The battles were brutal. In the city of Chongqing, a siege in 1948 turned into one of the war's greatest horrors. Nationalist troops held the city, while communist forces encircled it. For 5 months, civilians were trapped inside with dwindling food. Starvation gnawed at the population. Families boiled leather belts into soup. Children fainted in the streets. A witness recalled corpses lying unburied because no one had the strength to dig graves. When the city finally surrendered, tens of thousands were already dead. Yet for the communists, each victory built momentum. Mao's armies learned to fight as a conventional force, not only as guerrillas. By late 1948, they launched the 3 great campaigns that would decide the war: Laoshan in the northeast, Weihai in central China, and Pingjin in the north. The Weihai campaign, fought between November 1948 and January 1949, became a turning point. Over 500,000 communist troops faced nearly as many nationalists in a desperate battle across the farmlands of Jiangsu and Anhui. It was not just soldiers who fought. Hundreds of thousands of peasants joined the effort, hauling food and ammunition in wheelbarrows, carrying the wounded on their backs, and digging trenches with bare hands. Old men hitched oxen to carts, while women boiled rice for armies that seemed endless. A villager named Chen remembered, "We had no guns, but we had our arms and legs. We carried grain all night, through mud and rain. My wife tied our baby to her back and still loaded baskets of beans. We were fighting, too, in our way." The campaign ended in disaster for the nationalists. Entire divisions surrendered, their commanders demoralized and their troops exhausted. By early 1949, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly as communist victories mounted. Panic spread through nationalist ranks. In Nanjing, officials burned documents and loaded their families onto ships bound for Taiwan. Banks emptied their vaults, shipping gold reserves across the strait. Chiang Kai-shek, still defiant but increasingly isolated, prepared for retreat. In April 1949, communist forces crossed the Yangtze River, sweeping into the heart of southern China. Nanjing fell with little resistance, Shanghai soon after. Refugees flooded the road southward, carts piled high with bedding and children clinging to their mothers. By October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop the gate of heavenly peace in Beijing and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. Red flags waved across Tiananmen Square as thousands cheered, their voices carrying across a city scarred by decades of war. For many, it was a moment of hope, the promise of land, peace, and a new beginning. For others, it was the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Uncertain and heavy with shadows, families torn apart by war now faced a different kind of struggle. How to live under a revolution that promised everything, but demanded everything in return. When Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the crowd in Tiananmen Square roared with exhilaration. For many who had endured decades of war, it was a moment of triumph, a sense that history had turned a page. Red flags fluttered against the autumn sky, peasants and students embraced, and the air was heavy with the dream of a new beginning. Yet behind the cheering, the reality of the new nation was grim. China was broken. Entire provinces were scarred by the war. Bridges lay in ruins, roads were impassable, and cities were shells of their former selves. Refugees still wandered across the countryside, searching for homes that no longer stood. The economy was crippled by inflation. In some markets, currency was so worthless that traders preferred bartering grain or cloth instead of accepting paper money. For Mao and the Communist Party, the first task was survival, to consolidate power and restore basic order. This meant eliminating rivals, feeding the people, and beginning to reshape society according to revolutionary ideals. The land reform campaigns of the early 1950s were among the first dramatic steps. For centuries, Chinese villages had been dominated by landlords who owned vast fields, while peasants toiled endlessly with little to show for their labor. Now the party declared a new era. Land would be taken from the wealthy and redistributed to the poor. Teams of party cadres entered villages armed with registers, banners, and slogans. In public struggle sessions, peasants were encouraged, and often forced, to denounce their landlords. Some accused them of charging unbearable rents, others of hoarding grain during famine years. Landlords, dragged before their neighbors, were humiliated, beaten, and sometimes executed. Their estates were carved up into smaller plots, and peasants who had once mowed at their doors now plowed the same soil as owners. For many peasants, it was liberation. An old farmer named Liu in Hunan told his grandson years later, "The day they gave me land, I kissed the earth. I worked the same fields all my life, but for the first time, they were mine. For others, it was terror." Families who had lived as minor landlords for generations suddenly found themselves branded as enemies of the people. Their children were mocked in schools, their names blackened in village meetings, their futures stolen overnight. Alongside land reform came campaigns against counter-revolutionaries. Former officials of the nationalist regime, suspected spies, even scholars who questioned the party line were arrested or executed. Newspapers published daily reports of trials and confessions. Public squares filled with crowds chanting slogans as accused men and women were paraded before them. Fear seeped into daily life. Neighbors whispered carefully. Families avoided speaking openly even at dinner tables. Yet at the same time, there was an undeniable energy in the air. Roads were being rebuilt. Schools opened in villages that had never had them. Clinics established to treat peasants who had known only folk remedies. Literacy campaigns spread through the countryside, teaching millions to read simple characters for the first time. Women, long confined to silence and obedience, were promised new rights. The marriage law of 1950 banned arranged marriages, concubinage, and child brides, declaring that women could choose their own husbands and divorce freely. For some, this was revolutionary. A young woman named May, once promised at 12 to a wealthy merchant 3 times her age, fled her village during the war. In 1950, she returned to find the law on her side. She refused the marriage, married a farmer of her own choosing, and later recalled, "I felt like I had been born twice, first from my mother, and then from the law." But progress carried shadows. The redistribution of land brought immediate relief, but it also fractured villages. Old friendships were broken, families split, neighbors turned on neighbors. In the fervor to punish landlords, many innocents were swept away. Some peasants quietly admitted years later that they had denounced others, simply out of fear of being denounced themselves. The party's hand grew heavier each year. In the 3 anti and 5 anti campaigns of the early 1950s, corruption, tax evasion, and profiteering were targeted. Businessmen in Shanghai, once the pride of China's commercial wealth, were hauled before investigators, fined heavily, or driven to suicide under relentless accusations. In one infamous case, a merchant named Joe leapt from his office window after being accused of speculation. His workers marched in his funeral procession, carrying banners that read, "We despise the exploiters." Still, in the villages, hope lingered. Newly literate children read aloud revolutionary poems to their parents. Women began attending village councils, their voices tentative but real. Peasants spoke of planting not for landlords but for themselves. Across the countryside, murals appeared on walls, red suns rising over golden fields. Peasants and workers hand in hand. Mao himself was presented as the embodiment of this new dawn. His portrait, smiling and strong, hung in schools and government offices, in homes beside family altars. To millions, he was the father of the new China, the man who had endured the long march, resisted the Japanese, and now delivered land to the poor. Songs praise him as the red sun in our hearts, but beneath the bright slogans, the seeds of future storms were being sown. The party had shown that it could build schools, clinics, roads, but also that it could destroy, ruthlessly and without hesitation. Those who cheered the redistribution of land whispered their fears at night. What if tomorrow? The party decided they were enemies too. By the late 1950s, Mao Zedong sought not only to rebuild China, but to leap ahead of history itself. He believed that through sheer willpower and collective effort, China could surpass the industrial might of the West in just a few years. The campaign became known as the Great Leap, for a name that promised hope but delivered one of the greatest human tragedies in history. Peasants were forced into people's communes, vast collectives where private farming was abolished. Families surrendered their tools, animals, even cooking pots to communal kitchens. In propaganda posters, smiling peasants fed steaming bowls of rice to workers and soldiers, their fields overflowing with golden harvests. In reality, the commune stripped people of autonomy and often of food itself. Officials, eager to please their superiors, exaggerated harvest figures. Reports claimed that yields had doubled or tripled, though in truth fields lay bare after disastrous experiments, close planting of seeds, deep plowing that destroyed topsoil. Grain was sent to the state based on inflated numbers, leaving villages with nothing. Hunger crept in slowly, then consumed the land. By 1959, Famine stalked the countryside. Parents boiled bark and weeds into thin soups. Children with swollen bellies lay listless on mats. Stories spread of desperate families eating leather shoes, of villages so silent that even birds seemed absent. In some provinces, cannibalism was whispered of, a horror unthinkable, yet born of desperation. One survivor from Anhui recalled, "We worked in the fields all day, but there was nothing to eat. My mother gave me her portion, and still she starved. One morning I woke, and she did not rise again. I buried her with hands too weak to hold the shovel." Historians estimate that between 20 and 30 million people perished in those years. It was a scar deeper than war, deeper than invasion. The famine was not caused by nature alone, but by the decisions of men, by a dream that had become delusion. As famine raged, dissent within the party grew. But Mao silenced critics. Some leaders were sidelined, accused of lacking faith in the revolution. Yet by the early 1960s, Mao's grip seemed weakened. Pragmatists like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping introduced limited reforms, restoring small private plots and easing restrictions. For a time, China breathed again. But Mao was not finished. In 1966, he unleashed the Cultural Revolution, calling on the youth to purge the nation of old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. Millions of students, organized as Red Guards, swarmed cities and villages, denouncing teachers, officials, even their own parents. Schools closed, temples burned, libraries were ransacked. Professors in Beijing universities were paraded in dunce caps through jeering crowds. Neighbors settled grudges by branding one another as counter-revolutionaries. A school teacher named Zhang described how her pupils turned against her. "They painted my face with ink, tied a board around my neck, and beat me with sticks. They said I was a poisonous weed. I had taught them poetry, and now they shouted, 'Down with Zhang.'" The chaos lasted a decade. Millions were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. Families were torn apart, children betraying parents, friends betraying friends. Mao's cult of personality reached terrifying heights. His little red book was carried like scripture, quoted in factories, classrooms, and even weddings. And yet, despite the destruction, the revolution did not break China. Out of its ashes, a new pragmatism emerged. After Mao's death in 1976, leaders like Deng Xiaoping steered China onto a different path, embracing economic reform while maintaining political control. Fields once collectivized were divided again into family plots. Markets buzzed with trade. Villages once starved began to thrive. Looking back, the story of China from the Opium Wars to the Cultural Revolution is one of relentless trial. Foreign powers once reduced a proud empire to humiliation through the poison of opium and the fire of gunboats. Civil wars, invasions, famine, and political upheaval cut down millions. And yet, through each storm, the Chinese people endured. A farmer who survived both of the famine and the Cultural Revolution once said simply, "We bent, but we did not break. We carried the weight of history, and still we walked." The legacy of this era is complex. It is a tale of unimaginable suffering, but also of resilience. China's rebirth was forged not in comfort, but in fire. The dreams and delusions of leaders scarred generations, but the determination of ordinary people, peasants, workers, teachers, mothers, kept the nation alive. On the banks of the Yangtze, in a village rebuilt many times from war and flood, an old woman once told her granddaughter, "Our ancestors smoked opium, and they fell. Our fathers fought wars, and they fell. But we rose again." You must remember this: China always rises again. History does not move in straight lines. It bends, it shatters, it rebuilds. The story of China, from the days of imperial splendor, through the humiliation of opium, the fire of foreign invasion, the blood of civil war, the famine of the Great Leap Forward, and the madness of the Cultural Revolution, is not simply a chronicle of suffering. It is also a story of endurance. For centuries, outsiders underestimated China. Foreign merchants once called it the sick man of Asia, a land bound by its past, unable to rise. Yet time after time, the Chinese people proved otherwise. They bent beneath storms but did not break. They buried their dead, rebuilt their homes, and passed their resilience to their children. In the silence after war and revolution, ordinary life always returned. A peasant sowed wheat in soil still littered with shell fragments. A mother taught her daughter to write characters on the wall of a half-ruined house. A teacher, once denounced, quietly reopened a village school. These small acts, invisible to history's grand stage, were the true heartbeat of survival. What, then, is the legacy of this journey? It is not only in the monuments or the speeches, but in the simple truth that a people who endured centuries of humiliation, hunger, and chaos are still here, countless, unbroken, and alive. The story that began with smoke, the bitter smoke of opium pipes and dimly lit dens, ended with fire. Not of destruction, but of renewal. Out of ruin, China rose again. Though the scars remain, they are also reminders of what was lost, of what was endured, and of what must never be repeated. In the end, history is not just the tale of emperors or revolutions. It is the whisper of a grandmother telling her granddaughter, "We rose again, and you will rise too." It is the memory carried in families and fields, and the rhythm of rivers that have flowed since time began. China's story is unfinished, as is the story of every nation. But if the past teaches anything, it is this: even when the world believes you are broken, you may yet rise again.